So we've let everything sit overnight, and then we started off with our starter yesterday, and I emptied it out about 3/4 of the way because I was making 2 loaves, and then I added flour and water back in. We had, you saw the pictures yesterday, about 1 hour in. Here it is 24 hours in, and you can see clearly the way that that is bubbling. Lots of that sour liquid accumulating on top, so definitely alive and active. Once we had proofed the yeast in the 2 bowls, we had this bowl, which was just the white part of the starter, which is the less sour part. And this is going to be our sweetbread dough. It rose up overnight, and started to deflate it. This one I've partially stirred, so here you can see these bubbles that have developed, and when I lift up the spoon you can see the bubbles bursting. You see those rough patches there? Those are burst bubbles. So when you're making a yeasted bread, the lift in the bread comes from the stretch of the gluten around the yeast as the yeast bubbles. So you're getting that round internal bubbles in the bread because the bread is blowing bubbles and the bubble mixture is the yeast and it stretches because of the gluten. Anyway, so this is going to be our sourdough. This is going to be our sweeter loaf. So far what we have in each one is a cup of the sourdough starter, about another 3/4 of a cup of flour with warm water to activate, mixed it, let it sit an hour, saw that everything was bubbly and active, added another 2 cups of flour to each to let that develop overnight. Now we're ready to bake. Here I am baking bread with y'all. So in this bowl is the sweeter bread, and that's going to turn into our nut bread. This dough is going to be enriched with some eggs and some almond milk, and then I'm going to add some ground walnut flour to it, knead it together, and then I'm going to roll it, and on half of it I'm going to roll like some kind of plain cinnamon bun, and the other half I'm going to roll like a fruity nut bun with ground up nuts and whatever dried fruit I can find in the house. So that's my plan, and here we go. So to dough number 1, I'm going to add a sufficient quantity of olive oil to start off enriching that dough. So I am guessing that that's about 1/4 cup of olive oil. And then I'm going to add another 1.5 cups of flour. So I'm going to take my eggs, and if you don't want to use eggs if you're vegan, that's no problem. This bread in particular, because we're going to use some ground nuts in the flour, it's going to get some of that richness there, so you could increase the amount of nuts or you could increase the amount of oil to give it that same structure. So that would be no problem. I have these wonderful local eggs, and I'm happy that I have those. So I'm taking this dough and I'm just folding the eggs and that flour in, and it's kind of deflating because this dough has already started to rise, and also combining that oil into there. And remember, this was already a pretty sizable lump of dough when this started to go in, so those are going to get incorporated a little slowly. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the almond milk, and then incorporate that, and then we're going to make and add the walnut flour. So here we go. And I don't even really need to get that kneaded since more things are getting added in. All I need to do is to get it started to incorporate, which it has. Now, so I'm going to go get my almond milk in one moment, because in the meantime, this is our sourdough bread. That's at a similar point. It's got 3 to 3.5 cups of flour in it. It's got warm water, yeast, salt, starter, flour, and it has all of the sour liquid from the starter in it. So I'm going to look at that and see what needs to happen to this to get it all the way to being bread. And it looks like really not much at this point. So this one might just be super fast. So this is where my hands are going in it. So this one has had no olive oil in it, so definitely we're going to want some olive oil in it. And also some on my hands. So again, I would say that was more like 1/3 of a cup of olive oil, and then plus probably a good at least half tablespoon to tablespoon. Okay, and a little flour here. And then I'm going to go straight in with my hands this time, because it feels like it's about there. And that is looking so beautiful. So you've got flour incorporating in, you've got the point where it's forming a ball and it's holding together. It does not yet have the slap butt texture. So, all right, so we are ready for more kneading. So here we go. So, I'm going to turn this out on the board with all that flour. I'm going to use my fingers as a bit of a scraper. I'm going to put this, try to get most of it out in this round. Okay, so got the dough, we're putting it on the flour, and we're starting to work it towards its final consistency, or semi-final consistency. So it's going around, it's picking up flour, and what I'm starting to feel is it's a bit sticky on my hands, so I'm going to turn it with the flour and work some more of that flour in to keep it from sticking. That's better, still a little sticky. Some more flour goes in there. Now I feel like it's at the point where it's starting to feel almost right. So I'm going to try just one handful of flour, because you don't want it to be too much. There we go. So you can see from this baking why it is that if somebody is gluten-free, it is very difficult to bake for them in a kitchen where you bake frequently, because when you bake, there is a certain amount of flour dust that just does go up in the air and settles. And so on the occasions when I'm baking for somebody who's gluten intolerant or full-on celiac, I have to really vacuum the kitchen, wash everything in the kitchen, wash every dish, wash every spoon that I'm going to be using, and be super careful, because otherwise just that amount of gluten that flies about can really be not so good for those friends in that position. Okay, so it's picked up all the flour, so I'm going to add about another 1.5 tablespoons of olive oil on my hands. Yep. Well, it's a little sticky still. All right. Not quite the slap, but very close. The other nice thing about doing this oil part at the end is that it is going to coat the outside of the bread lightly, so that when I set it to rise this time, it's not going to dry out nearly as fast, because it's going to have that little bit of oil on the outside. Okay. I want it really smooth. Alright, good. So now the walnut flour and the almond milk. I have what looks to me to be about a cup and a half of walnuts, and I'm going to pop those in a food processor, and I'm gonna chop them up. So. I hope you're all marveling at the skill with which I assembled that food processor. I'm hoping that it will work. Okay, here we go. point, the walnuts form essentially a powdery crumble is what I would call it. And actually this way of processing walnuts is great for making fruit crumbles, so I encourage it. We have the walnut flour. We have this is the sourdough dough. This can sit over here and hang out on its own. This is what we're focused on. We are going to add probably a cup of that ground walnut flour to that. And we're going to add a cup of almond milk to that. We're going to add the rest of this flour, which I feel like isn't going to be enough because that looks like it's about a cup of flour, so we're going to need more. All right. First I'm going to incorporate that. And so when you eat this, you're not going to get a sense of eating a nut. The goal is not to bite down and crunch a nut. The goal of this is that there's going to be sort of a buttery, crumbly element to the dough. It also gives it a little extra protein, which is never a bad thing. Okay, more flour. Cinnamon rolls. So we have activated dough with warm water. We added flour to that. We sat it overnight. And then we added some more flour today, made it up into a bit of a thicker mixture, rose well. We grated walnuts and we added some almond milk. And I'm going to put about 2/3 of that dough into that flour for the moment. Because I think I'm going to do 2 different things with this. Okay. And I've put that out into quite a lot of flour because it is not at all close to being kneadable dough. It is really just in the, it's practically liquid, but a very slow moving liquid, relatively speaking. Okay, and here it is, starting to look more like dough. Now the walnuts, of course, do not have any gluten properties. So the more walnuts are in it, the less things that you have that will stretch. So a nut-enriched dough will never stretch as much as a non-nutty dough. To make up for that, the nuts are very rich in oils, and so it's like little pockets of butter, essentially, but it's butter made out of a nut. Inside the bread, tiny little fragments that give it that rich crumble. Here we go. This is looking like dough now. Right. Alright, so this is what is going to form the basis of my cinnamon rolls. Lovely. Just gonna pat it with olive oil so it doesn't dry out. Time passes by like a slow train in the night.